About the poem Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. First of all, this poem is at the beginning of a book called Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There by Lewis Carroll. It is the sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Some of you may have seen the recent film adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, but I want you to note the difference in titles. The Disney version is just simply called Alice in Wonderland. The book by Lewis Carroll is technically called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It's a minor difference, but I think it's significant when you consider that the movie doesn't really follow the book. At the beginning of at the beginning of Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, Alice finds herself in the library looking at the chess set. Alice then falls through the mirror above the fireplace. The mirror is the looking glass, which is an old-fashioned name for a mirror. When she falls through the mirror, she picks up a book and opens it and realizes all the words are backward. The book that she has picked up is on the first entry in the book is the poem Jabberwocky, which she then holds up to the mirror so that she can read the words, and she reads the poem. She doesn't really understand the poem when she first reads it. If we click on this link right here, we'll come to a PDF of the poem Jabberwocky, and you can go ahead and open that on your own if you open up the Google slide presentation. A little bit about Lewis Carroll. His real name was Charles Dodgson. He wrote under the pen name of Lewis Carroll, and he was the tutor to a family of children in England. Many of the stories he tells in Alice in Wonderland are all stories which he told the children that were in his care. He had a very wild imagination, and I think there were a lot of times that they had long summer days with not a lot to do, and so he would fill the time by telling them fantastic stories of Alice and her adventures in Wonderland. Eventually in the book, Alice meets Humpty Dumpty, and Humpty Dumpty is able to tell her what the poem actually means. And he explains to her this idea of a literary device that we like to call the portmanteau, which you will see a little bit more about in a little bit. Here is an illustrated picture of Alice speaking to Humpty Dumpty. And they talk a little bit at first about the meanings of words. And most people, when they hear Jabberwocky, they wonder a lot about the first stanza of Jabberwocky, which sounds like a whole lot of made-up words, and that's because it is a whole lot of made-up words. Let's take a closer look at the first stanza of Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borogroves, and the momes wrath out gabe." For a further explanation of what some of those words mean, you can click on this link here in the Google presentation, and you can learn that. What I can tell you of what I know is this is a little bit of a foreshadowing of what happens in the poem. This is all about a particular bird that lives on a sundial, and a large animal comes that I think is threatening this bird. And that is the explanation for that first part of the poem. And now let's learn a little bit more about a portmanteau. A portmanteau is where you combine two words to make a new word. Examples from this poem include slithy, which equals lithe and slimy, or mimsy, which is the combination of flimsy and miserable. We have frabjous, which is the combination of fabulous and joyous. We have glumping, which equals gallop plus triumphant, and chortled, which equals chuckle and snort. And there are plenty of more portmanteaus throughout this poem called Jabberwocky. And you might see portmanteaus in some other poems. It is a literary device that poets use to help them tell their story. I think one person could explain poetry as telling a very dramatically filled story with as few words as possible. So, to this effect, many poets are engaging in what we call poetic license. And Lewis Carroll is perhaps the best example of a poet using poetic license. Poetic license is defined as license or liberty taken by a poet, prose writer, or other artist in deviating from rule, conventional form, logic, or fact in order to produce a desired effect. So what that means is that if you are being creative in your writing, you get to make up words and phrases to fit the needs of your poetry. And that is exactly what Lewis Carroll did in the poem Jabberwocky. He makes use of a lot of other literary devices, such as repetition. We see the first and last stanza being repeated. He has very predictable rhyme and meter throughout his poems, which make them very fun poems to memorize. I encourage you to try to memorize a poem. And as a side note, I will let you know that I memorized Jabberwocky when I was in 6th grade, and I have never forgotten it. And I pull it out frequently at moments when people are not expecting it, and it always raises an eyebrow or two. Some more poems by Lewis Carroll include The Walrus and the Carpenter, which is also found in the Alice books, The Hunting of the Snark, which is an epic poem, and Sylvia and Bruno, which is another epic poem. Now, an epic poem, if you're wondering, is a poem that is very, very long and tells a very dramatic story. Some epic poems can be as long as a book. So if you're feeling up to the task of diving into some more challenging poems by Lewis Carroll, please Google search and you probably will find good PDFs of these poems. Otherwise, you can also check out your local library for the complete works of Lewis Carroll.